Welcome back to another episode of the IC 109 podcast.
You're at 109 right now.
I'll be continuing reading California's Black Pioneers, a brief historical survey by Kenneth G. Goode. I'll read chapter 2 today. The Mexican Era, 1821-1848. The change from Spanish to Mexican rule was fairly uneventful in California, the only revolutionary activity being the sacking and burning of several coastal towns, including the Presidio and town of Monterrey in November 1818. This was done by the crew of privateer Hippolyte de Bouchard, which included Malaysians, Spaniards, Englishmen, Australians, and Moors, seeking to profit from the unstable condition of the Spanish Empire in the New World. Under Spanish rule, foreigners were not allowed to settle in California. However, the English, French, Russians, and Americans were all keenly interested in acquiring the territory. During the Spanish era, the English had established a colony at at Nootka Sound. The Russians had built Fort Ross. The French had already sent several geographic, scientific, and commercial expeditions, and New England sea traders and whalers were stopping more frequently along the California coastline to reprovision, make repairs, and engage in an already flourishing contraband trade. Although Spanish law prohibited trade with foreign countries, the Spanish colonists in California who were being neglected by the central government welcomed it. New England Filipino and Chinese wares were exchanged for sea otter furs, steer hides, tallow, and cow horns. However, in 1824, the Mexican government passed a law encouraging colonization and promising security of persons and property of foreigners who settled in Alta California. Taken as an invitation to foreigners to begin conducting business on a systematic basis in California, this law saw the start of foreign migration into California. One such person who settled in California during the Mexican era was the black trader William Alexander Leidsdorf, a native West Indian whose mother was black and father white. In 1841, at the age of 21, he sailed into San Francisco Bay in his 106-ton schooner, having departed from New Orleans 3 years earlier. Between 1841 and 1845, Leidsdorf operated a trading vessel sailing from San Francisco to Hawaii. He not only prospered in the trading business, but in 1846 purchased several parcels of property located in what is now the heart of San Francisco's financial district. On a portion of this land, he built San Francisco's first hotel. Leidsdorf's holdings also included a large warehouse on what was then Yerba Buena Cove. Appointed American vice consul at Yerba Buena in 1845, Leidsdorf authored the official report of the Bear Flag Incident, which heralded the American takeover of California, and submitted it to U.S. Consul Thomas O. Larkin at Monterey. The following year, after purchasing a steamship from the Russians at Sitka, Alaska, Leidsdorf piloted the first steamboat into San Francisco Bay. At the age of 36, the Mexican government gave him a land grant of 35,000 acres in the Sacramento Valley, just east of John Sutter's New Helvetia ranch, on which gold is said to have been discovered. Already having become a Mexican citizen in 1844, William Leidsdorf soon became an agent for the Russian American Fur Company with a contract to furnish supplies and collect payment from John Sutter for the purchase of Fort Ross. Later in 1848, Leidsdorf added to his already valuable holdings with the purchase of a large ranch on the site of which today a part of the city of Lafayette is located. Active in the commercial, social, and political affairs of the San Francisco community after America's conquest of the territory, Leidsdorf served as the town's first treasurer and as a town councilman. He was also one of three school board members appointed to oversee the construction of the first public school in the city of San Francisco. On May 18, 1848, William A. Leidsdorf died at the age of 38. He was buried beneath the floor of Mission Dolores Chapel in San Francisco. On the day of his funeral, all local businesses closed, flags were flown at half mast, and guns were fired during the funeral ceremonies. Other Afro Americans arriving in California during the Mexican era came as fur trappers, hunters, and members of overland expeditions. Allen B. Light, a successful otter hunter in California, became a Mexican citizen and later was appointed Comisario General in charge of the suppression of illegal otter hunting. James Beckwourth, whose exploits rival those of his associates Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, was another famous Afro American hunter and scout who migrated to California. Never a permanent California resident, Beckwourth took part in the Bear Flag Rebellion in 1845 and, along with the Native Americans, stole large numbers of horses and sold them in Mexico. During 1847 and 1848, Beckwourth served as a U.S. Army scout and later carried mail Pony Express style between Monterey and Southern California. Not only did he participate in the gold rush, he was one of the first settlers in Plumas County. Moving to New Mexico in 1857, Beckwourth died there in 1866. At least one black man, Peter Rain, was with Jedediah Smith, leader of the first Overland Party to California in 1826. Jacob Dodson, a free Afro American, was in the Fremont expeditions, which came to California in 1843 to 1844 and again in 1845. Another free black, Saunders Jackson, joined Fremont's fourth California expedition 3 years later. It was also known that John A. Sutter employed a black cook and cooper on his ranch near Sacramento. Afro Americans were also included in the overland expeditions of James Patty, Ewing Young, William Wolfskill, Milton and William Sublett, Kit Carson, George Nidever, John Marsh, John Bidwell, the Childs Walker Party, the Stevens Murphy Party, the Workman Rowland Party, and other immigrant parties that wound their way from St. Louis, Independence, Omaha, Memphis, and St. Joseph to California. Some Afro Americans reached California shores during the Mexican era by escaping from New England whalers and trading vessels which plied the seas between Boston, San Francisco, Hawaii, the Philippines, and China. On reaching California, where the vessels replenished their food and fuel supply, blacks often would jump ship or be left behind to become absorbed eventually into California's black communities in San Francisco, Sacramento, or the frontier. Many blacks who took up California residence were sailors, including Cristobal from the Albatross, Anderson Norris from the Cyane, Hood Frisbee from the Isaac, Francis Lamott, and Francisco, who took part in the Bouchard expedition, and Fizar, who sailed with the Santa Rosa. There were many others. During the Mexican era, English speaking Afro Americans were also moving westward with the expansion of slavery. As early as 1803, the populations of Louisiana and Missouri, starting points for a number of overland expeditions to California, included several thousand blacks, slave and free. Beginning in the 1820s, slaves from the Deep South were taken in large numbers into Texas and Kansas, and in smaller numbers into New Mexico, Arizona, and the Indian Territory. It has been established that free Afro Americans were also living in these areas in the early part of the 19th century. Therefore, there is considerable evidence to support the belief that Afro Americans arrived in California from Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona via the old Spanish Trail. Furthermore, by the 1830s, New Mexican merchants had organized an important caravan trade in woolens, blankets, silver coin, horses, mules, and other commodities between Los Angeles and Santa Fe, and there is no reason to doubt that a number of blacks migrated to California via this caravan route, along with whites. What aroused the interest of the early American California settlers was an extraordinary advertising campaign that began early in 1840 and continued with growing effectiveness until the Mexican War. In leading journals and newspapers such as the New York Sun, the New York Herald, the Journal of Commerce, the Boston Advertiser, the Whig Review, and Hunt's Merchants magazine, California was described as the land of boundless fertility, matchless climate, and inexhaustible natural wealth. The harbor at San Francisco was said to be the best in the world, its forests the largest on earth, and the valleys of Sacramento and the San Joaquin, capable of supporting a population of 20 million people. During California's Spanish and Mexican periods, civil and military authority was firmly in the hands of European born Spaniards. Despite this, however, a few blacks and mulattoes attained positions of leadership. Emmanuel Victoria, a mulatto, rose through military ranks to become a lieutenant colonel and comandante of Baja California, a distinction almost unequaled in a hierarchy where non European Spaniards seldom rose above the rank of carbo or corporal in the army. In 1830, the black governor, as Victoria was called, was ordered to Alta California to forestall secularization of the mission system and to restore peace. The tall, lean lieutenant colonel, who was believed by some pro secularizationists to owe his appointment to the influence of the missionaries, arrived in Alta California in January 1831 and journeyed to Santa Barbara to await Governor Jose Maria Echeandia, who would formally turn over the governorship to him. Among the pro secularizationists who resented the central government for its indifference and neglect were such prominent men as Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, Jose Antonio Carrillo, Pio Pico, himself a mulatto, Jose Castro, and Juan Baptista Alvarado. While Victoria waited to become governor, Echeandia, on January 6, 1831, issued a decree of secularization. Victoria then traveled to Monterrey, the capital, where he took the oath of office as political and military governor of California on January 31, 1831. One of Victoria's first acts was to issue a proclamation suspending the execution of Echeandia's plan of secularization, under which the missions would have been converted into pueblos, and the neophytes, newly baptized Native Americans, who were virtual slaves, would have been granted mission held land in their own names. His next move was to transfer the adju- adjutant inspector of troops, Jose Maria Padres, to San Francisco. Victoria believed that Padres, an advocate of Republican ideals, who had come to Alta California the previous year, was the real author of the plan of secularization and was responsible for Echeandia's delay in turning over the office of governor in order to issue the secularization decree. Subsequently, Victoria expelled Padres and several other Mexican citizens without a trial or legal authority. He believed they were conspiring to overthrow him. Victoria refused to convene the deputation, provincial legislature, which he considered to be under the influence of Padres, and which, if convened, would endorse the plan for secularization. The ayuntamiento and most of the citizens of Monterrey were ardent followers of the young California liberals who opposed Victoria and had supported the liberal policies of Governor Echeandia. Soon they began to express their opposition to the new militarist, conservative governor. They regarded him as a cruel tyrant at whose hands all citizens were in danger. Supported by missionaries and those who adhered to the status quo, Victoria became more despotic and reactionary. He recommended to the central government the abolition of the ayuntamientos and the restoration of military rule. Without waiting for a reply, he set out to reform abuses. He ordered the death penalty for the crime of robbery of small sums and other minor offenses. He tried an alcalde by court martial. His harsh treatment of the Native Americans caused him to be looked upon as a bloodthirsty monster. While this was going on, petition after petition, signed by a number of prominent Californians, were sent to Victoria. His reply was to issue a manifesto to the public in which he defined his policy in very clear terms, stating that he was convinced of the illegality of the election of many members of the deputation, that he was aware of their seditious purposes, and that he was determined the deputation should not meet again until a decision was reached by the central government. Representatives were sent to Mexico complaining of the governor's refusal to convene the legislative body and of his various arbitrary acts, calling upon the central government to protect the people against his oppressive usurpation. Although Padres counseled moderation in moving against Victoria in the interest of public peace, Pio Pico, Juan Bandini, and the returning exile Jose Antonio Carrillo on November 29th, 1831, drew up a pronunciamiento calling for the expulsion of Victoria, separation of military and political command, and provisional resumption by Echeandia of both commands until such time as the deputation could take action or the decision of the central government could be received. The pronunciamiento set forth the abuses Victoria had committed in violation of the Constitution of 1824 and concluded by stating that it was the people's natural right to expel him. The pronunciamiento, the first issued in California, was signed December 1st, 1831 by Echeandia, the three original drafters, and all members of the deputation. In addition to the demand for Victoria's removal, the insurgents took possession of the Presidio and garrison at San Diego and marched to Los Angeles, where the inhabitants accepted them with enthusiasm. Victoria countered by marching with a small force in late November 1831 from Monterey to Santa Barbara, the center of pro missionary sentiment, where a small detachment of soldiers joined him. Proceeding to Los Angeles, he was met at Coanga Pass by a force of 150 men led by the commander of the San Diego garrison. After Victoria admonished the rebels, His forces opened fire. There was a skirmish during which one of Victoria's men was killed and Victoria himself was wounded. With his forces, he retired to San Gabriel Mission, where he decided to return to Mexico and interfere no further with affairs in California. He had evidently concluded that opposition to his rule was so widespread there was little hope of overcoming it, especially since only a handful of soldiers were loyal to him. Meeting an extraordinary session at Los Angeles on January 10th, 1832, the deputation resolved that a senior vocal assemblyman, Pio Pico, another mulatto, should act as governor ad interim in the event that Echeandia refused. When Echeandia made no reply to the deputation's request, that body swore Pico into office as jefe politico, civil chief, as the new governor was to be called on January 27, 1832. This action displeased Echeandia, who now warned against haste in separating the civil and military offices without a careful definition of each. To this, Pico replied by suggesting the appointment of a committee to draw up a constitution or plan of government. Echeandia nevertheless refused to recognize Pico, whom he considered incompetent, and indicated in a letter to the deputation that he might have to resort to force, an action for which the deputation would have to consider itself responsible. But neither side wanted to resort to arms, and a compromise was reached in February 1832. Pico resigned his office, the deputation agreed to suspend its meetings, and the military command was divided between Echeandia in the south and Captain Augustin Vicente Zamorano, Victoria's secretary, in the north. California's Spanish period also saw blacks and mulattoes appointed to the position of mayordomo, majordomo, mayordomo, a supervisory post at the missions. Several prominent blacks, such as Francisco Reyes, the mulatto mayor of Los Angeles from 1793 to 1795, became owners of leaseholders of large estates. Reyes was the first rancher in the San Fernando Valley, followed by Jose Bartolome Tapia, mulatto owner of the Rancho Malibu bordering the Pacific Ocean, and Manuel Nieto, a mulatto soldier who secured rights to graze his large cattle and horse herds on 167,000 acres located southeast of the city of Los Angeles. These blacks and mulattoes, among others, had attained the social and economic status of landed gentry. Achieving probably greater success and social prominence than any other mulatto family in California, the Pico family included high ranking military officials, large estate holders, government officials, and a state governor. Pio Pico was probably the most distinguished of all of the Picos. In the fall of 1835, the death of Governor Jose Figueroa, one of early California's ablest governors, ushered in a decade of revolution. In the short space of 13 months, four governors held office. The first was Colonel Mariano Chico from Mexico, who held the offices of both jefe politico, civil governor, and comandante militar, military governor. A few weeks after taking office, Chico succeeded in making himself California's most hated governor by refuting the liberal policies of home rule instituted by Governor Figueroa and imposing principles of centralism. When Governor Chico left Alta California due to heavy pressure from liberal native Californians in the fall of 1836, the office of governor was left in the hands of Lieutenant Colonel Nicolas Gutierrez, another centralist. In the absence of a permanent legal governor, Gutierrez continued to refuse to deliver the office of jefe politico to the first vocal of the deputation as required by law and insulted the deputation by dismissing it. In 1836, Gutierrez was displaced by Juan B. Alvarado, perhaps the most astute of all the governors of the Mexican era. With the aid of Native Americans, Californians, and American immigrants, Alvarado successfully revolted against the central government and declared California an independent, free, and sovereign state, pending reinstatement of the federal Constitution of 1824. In September 1837, news reached Los Angeles in a letter from Jose Antonio Carrillo, Alta California's deputy in the Mexican Congress, that his brother, Don Carlos Carrillo, had been appointed governor of the territory. This resulted in a sectional dispute between northern and southern Californians after Alvarado's forces defeated a detachment of Carrillo's supporters at Ventura, occupied Los Angeles, and negotiated an informal armistice at La Mesa in August 1838, a report was received from Mexico announcing that the federal government had withdrawn the appointment of Carrillo and bestowed the governorship on Alvarado. In November, Alvarado was confirmed, thus becoming the first native born constitutional governor of Alta California. The friction between Alvarado, who was the civil governor, and Mariano G. Vallejo, Comandante General of the military, became so pronounced that on December 31st, 1842, a Mexican general, Manuel Michel Torrena, was appointed civil and military governor of Alta California. Arriving with an army of 500 vagabonds and cutthroats, Michel Torrena managed by taking advantage of the tragically unstable state of affairs to remain in office for 2 years before home rule advocates Alvarado and Castro in the north and the brothers Pio and Andres Pico in the south started a revolution, which resulted in the expulsion of Governor Michel Torrena and his army. In February 1845, articles of capitulation were signed, turning over the governor's political authority to Pio Pico and the military command to Jose Castro. Though Governor Pico was not universally admired, upon assuming office, he immediately began a serious effort to reestablish a republican form of government. Assuring creditors of the territorial government that they would be paid, Pico suspended the payment of government debts. Subsequently, the decision was made to rent or sell the missions in order to satisfy the government's creditors and to obtain funds for the defense of the territory in case of war with the United States, which was then threatening. Pico set aside the prohibition against whalers landing at Alta California ports and sought the strict enforcement of laws prohibiting illegal coastal trade. He encouraged local agricultural production and the retention of locally produced goods. Evidence of his efforts to stabilize the territorial government is found in the number of receipts collected by the Customs House, the main source of territorial government revenue. In 1845, receipts amounted to $140,000, an increase of almost $10,000 over the previous year. Pico also reestablished the credibility of the territorial legislature. The Asamblea, as the legislature was now called, remained in session from April through August and participated in all important measures undertaken by the Pico administration. Pico's recommendations for home rule and a reduction in duties placed on imports were approved by the central government, after which the Asamblea, upon Pico's urging, petitioned the Congress in Mexico to reform the fundamental law of the land by adopting a constitution similar to that of 1824, which guaranteed a republican form of government. Pico took steps to reorganize the territorial judiciary. The Mexican laws of March 20 and May 23rd, 1837 established judges of the first instance, intermediate court, and a tribunal superior, Supreme Court, which together with the alcalde court, the lower court, constituted the backbone of California's court system. However, the alcalde court was designed to prevent litigation and was essentially conciliatory. If no agreement was reached, the parties merely received certificates showing that conciliation had been attempted. At the amount in question, if the amount in question exceeded $100 and the plaintiff was a subject of the territory, there could be an appeal to the judge of first instance and then to the tribunal superior. Previously, the appellate courts rarely met, and consequently, very few cases were taken before them. By December 1845, the courts of Northern California appear to have begun to function, but any increase in case volume was an improvement over previous inactivity. Governor Pico made numerous grants of land to native Californians and foreigners in a further effort to bolster California's economy. Pico felt that an adequate system of private property ownership was a prerequisite of a Republican form of government. Under ordinary conditions, Governor Pico might have gone down in history as a man who translated some of the ideals of the Enlightenment into reality in Alta California. However, even though he and other liberals such as Alvarado, Castro, and Carrillo thought they were acting in the best interest of the inhabitants of Alta California, granting land, emancipating Indians, protecting the territory against foreign invaders, attempting home rule, raising public funds by taxing imports and exports. In actuality, they were creating and sustaining a rancho mercantile class who alone were benefiting from the acts of liberalism. At a time when circumstances should have united the purposes and energy of Governor Pio Pico and Comandante Castro, a sectional dispute between the two further weakened an already weak California. Pico used his position to remove the capital to Los Angeles, but Castro had control of the customs house at Monterrey. The issue was what percentage of the revenues should be allocated to the military and political branches. Pico was in control of the legislature, but Castro had possession of the funds. Abandoning all hope of convincing Governor Pico that U.S. Army Major John C. Fremont's presence in California was for purposes other than to conduct a scientific expedition, and that the increasing number of American immigrants, especially the reported incoming 10,000 Mormons, posed a real threat to the territorial government, Castro sent a long letter to Pico announcing that the territory was under siege and declaring martial law. Pico then began to prepare to attack Castro, but after hearing that the Americans had captured Sonoma, Pico cast aside envy, personal ambition, and suspicion of Castro and urged Californians to take whatever measures were necessary to save the territory. But his efforts were in vain. After turning down Commodore Robert F. Stockton's proposal to declare California independent of Mexico and seek the protection of the United States, Comandante Castro announced on August 8, 1846, his intention to leave the territory, and on August 11, 1846, Governor Pico dismissed the Asamblea and joined Castro in exile. I just finished reading Chapter 2 of California's Black Pioneers, a brief historical survey by Kenneth G. Goode. Chapter 2 is entitled The Mexican Era, 1821 to 1848. You're at
You're at 109 right now.
Peace and blessings, y'all.